Summer 2019. Humphreys County, Mississippi, the catfish capital of the world. A drug-resistant strain of Flavobacterium bacteria swept through high-density industrial ponds. The most advanced antibiotics failed. Operations running 5,700 fish per acre lost 70% of their stock in 3 weeks. Hundreds of thousands of dollars gone. Then Mississippi State researchers found something extraordinary 3 miles away. A 70-year-old black farmer named Clarence Webb, farming 12 acres the way his family had farmed since 1962. No aerators, no chemicals, no antibiotics. In 60 years, 0 fish lost. His pond's microbial ecosystem was so intact and diverse it was suppressing the resistant bacteria through pure biological competition. The industry had spent decades building the disease. Clarence had spent decades building the cure. The heat arrived in Humphreys County the way it always did in the Mississippi Delta, not gradually, but all at once, as though someone had opened an enormous furnace door and forgotten to close it. By the second week of June 2019, the thermometer outside the Delta Pride processing plant in Belzoni had already touched 97 degrees Fahrenheit before 9 in the morning, and the air above the catfish ponds shimmered with a heat so thick it looked almost solid. The county, which locals called the catfish capital of the world, held some of the most productive aquaculture operations in the United States. Tens of thousands of acres of carefully engineered concrete and earthen ponds, each one packed with channel catfish, destined for processing plants that shipped fillets to grocery chains across the country. Clarence Webb had been watching those ponds for 51 years. He was 70 years old in the summer of 2019, a lean, deliberate man with hands that had been calloused by pond work since he was 19, when his father first handed him a seine net and showed him how to read the color of the water. His family had farmed catfish in Humphreys County long before the industrial boom of the 1980s transformed the Delta into America's primary catfish production region, and Clarence ran his operation, 12 acres of natural earthen ponds on land his grandfather had cleared, in a manner that had not changed substantially in 4 decades. No aerators humming through summer nights. No industrial feed delivery systems. No antibiotics stockpiled in the barn. Keith was 42 years old, a trained aquaculture engineer with a master's degree from Mississippi State University and 12 years of experience optimizing yield per acre metrics for one of the largest catfish operations in the state. He had built Consolidated's production from 3,200 pounds per acre to 5,700 pounds per acre over a decade, a 78% improvement that had earned him a profile in the Mississippi Catfish Farmers Association newsletter and an invitation to present at the 2018 Aquaculture America Conference in Las Vegas. Keith had driven past Clarence's ponds dozens of times without paying them particular attention. A 12-acre operation stocked at roughly 1,500 fish per acre, less than a third of Consolidated's density, simply didn't register as meaningful competition. It registered, if anything, as a curiosity, an old man doing things the old way, producing perhaps 18,000 to 20,000 pounds of catfish per year, when the industrial model could achieve that yield on a single well-managed acre. Keith had nothing against Clarence personally. He just couldn't see the point. He would spend the rest of 2019 reconsidering that judgment. The first sign of trouble appeared on the morning of June 17. Keith arrived at the Consolidated facility at 6:15, as he did every morning, and found his pond manager, David Tran, standing at the edge of Pond 7 with a flashlight, even though the sun had already cleared the tree line. David was staring at the water with an expression Keith had learned to read as professional alarm, not panic, but the kind of focused, controlled concern that meant something was wrong in a way that hadn't announced itself yet. "Fish are off," David said when Keith reached him. Keith looked at the water. The surface of Pond 7 appeared normal, the characteristic olive-green color of a healthy phytoplankton bloom, gentle ripples from the aerator paddles at the far end. But as he looked more carefully, he could see the fish. They were there, near the surface, moving, but the movement was wrong. too slow, too erratic. Several fish were holding near the edges of the pond rather than schooling in the middle, which was where well-fed, healthy catfish tended to congregate around feeding time. "Oxygen?" Keith asked. David shook his head. "Oxygen is fine. Logged 7.2 at midnight, 6.8 at 4. Temperature is 82. pH is 7.4. Everything reads normal." Keith crouched at the water's edge and scooped up a fish that was hanging lethargically within arm's reach. He held it up and turned it in the early morning light. Then he saw it, a pale, frayed lesion at the base of the dorsal fin, white at the center, the edges feathering into the surrounding tissue in a pattern that looked almost like mold growing on the fish. The fish's gills, when he pulled them open, were pale and discolored. "Get me 5 more fish," he said to David, "from different parts of the pond." Every fish David brought him showed the same lesions, some larger, some smaller, but all unmistakably present. Keith had seen columnaris before. Every catfish farmer in the Delta had seen columnaris. Flavobacterium columnare was endemic to warm freshwater environments throughout the southeastern United States, and it was considered, alongside enteric septicemia of catfish, the 2 leading causes of disease-related mortality in the American catfish industry. In the peer-reviewed literature, columnaris was responsible for losses estimated at $10 million to $16.9 million annually across the catfish-producing region. In high-density, high-stress production environments, where fish crowded together in warm, nutrient-rich water, columnaris could kill within 24 to 48 hours of the first visible symptoms. Keith's hands were very still as he held the 3rd fish and looked at the lesions. "Call Dr. Patterson," he said to David. "Call her right now." Dr. Susan Patterson was the aquatic animal health specialist at Mississippi State University's College of Veterinary Medicine, who had been Consolidated's consulting veterinarian for 6 years. She arrived on site by 10 that morning, collected tissue samples from 23 fish across 3 ponds, and called Keith with her preliminary assessment before she had even returned to Starkville. "It's columnaris," she said. "Probably Flavobacterium covei, the more virulent species. You've seen it before, but I need you to understand that this particular strain is behaving differently than what we normally see." "How differently?" Keith asked. "I'll know more in 48 hours, but the progression rate is faster than typical. And the fish aren't responding to oxytetracycline the way I'd expect. Start them on Aquaflor as soon as you can get it from your supplier, and get me samples from every pond, not just the ones showing symptoms." Keith ordered the Aquaflor, florfenicol, the most potent FDA-approved antibiotic available for fish disease in the United States, and began the process of getting medicated feed into every pond in the facility. It was an expensive intervention. Medicated feed cost roughly 3 to 4 times the price of standard floating pellets, and at consolidated scale, treating 340 acres of high-density ponds represented a significant and immediate financial impact. But Keith had done this before, and the economics were straightforward. The cost of treatment was always less than the cost of losing the fish. What he didn't yet know was that this time, the arithmetic was going to be different. By June 21, 4 days after the first lesions appeared in Pond 7, 12 of Consolidated's 38 production ponds showed clinical signs of columnaris infection. By June 25, it was 21 ponds. The Aquaflor was going into the feed, the fish were consuming it, and the columnaris was continuing to spread. Dr. Patterson called on the evening of June 26 with results from the bacterial cultures she had been running since the initial sample collection. Her voice was careful and precise in the way that specialists' voices become careful and precise when they are delivering information they know will be difficult to hear. "The strain is multi-drug resistant," she said. "We're seeing resistance to oxytetracycline, Romet, and now reduced susceptibility to florfenicol. This is an AMR strain, antimicrobial resistant." The antibiotic pressure in high-density operations over the past several years has been selecting for resistant strains, and this appears to be one of the most virulent we've documented in the Delta. Keith was quiet for a moment. Through the office window, he could see Pond 14 in the fading light, its aerator still turning, the water surface still carrying that familiar olive-green color. Somewhere beneath that surface, tens of thousands of fish were carrying a bacterium that his most potent medical tool could no longer reliably kill. "What are my options?" he asked. "Supportive care," Dr. Patterson said. "Keep oxygen high. Reduce feeding to decrease metabolic stress on the fish. Separate infected cohorts where you can. And we look at this as a selective pressure problem. The high-density environment has been incubating resistant strains. But those are medium-term solutions. Right now, you're going to lose fish." The losses at Consolidated began accumulating on a scale that Keith had not experienced in 12 years of managing the facility. A catfish production pond under normal operations might expect 3 to 5% annual mortality from disease, predation, and handling stress. By July 10, 3 weeks into the outbreak, mortality in affected ponds at Consolidated had reached 23%. By July 25, in the most severely affected ponds, cumulative mortality exceeded 70% of the stocked population. Fish that had been 4 to 6 months from harvest, fish representing months of feed costs, fingerling costs, and labor, were dying faster than David and the crew could remove them from the ponds. The economic calculation was unambiguous and brutal. A single high-density pond at Consolidated might hold 8,000 to 10,000 fish, each representing a market value of $1.40 to $1.60 per pound at a harvest weight of approximately 1.5 pounds. A pond losing 70% of its population was losing $16,800 to $22,000 in fish value alone, before accounting for the sunk costs of feed, fingerlings, aeration, electricity, and labor. Across the facility's most affected ponds, losses were accumulating in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Keith drove past Clarence Webb's property on the morning of July 12, on his way to a meeting with Consolidated's insurance broker. He noticed, as he sometimes did, the quiet surface of Clarence's ponds, no aerators, no automated feeding equipment visible from the road, just 12 acres of dark water bordered by natural vegetation, the surface carrying a different color than Consolidated's ponds, a deeper brown-green that came from the benthic ecosystem rather than the dense phytoplankton blooms that characterized high-density production. He noticed it, and then he drove past, because he was thinking about insurance adjusters and mortality reports, not about an old man's earthen ponds. Clarence Webb had known something was moving through the Delta operations since the first week of July, when his neighbor Robert Bobby Simmons, who ran a 45-acre operation with a mix of earthen and concrete-lined ponds, he had stopped by and told him about fish deaths at the Consolidated facility. Bobby was watching his own concrete ponds with heightened attention, and Clarence could see the worry in his neighbor's face. "You seeing anything in yours?" Bobby asked, nodding toward Clarence's property. Clarence thought about it. He had walked his ponds that morning, as he did every morning, not with instruments or monitoring equipment, but with his eyes and his hands, dipping his fingers into the water at each pond's edge, watching how the fish responded to his shadow, noting the color of the water and the smell of the air above it. What he had noticed that morning was ordinary. The ponds were functioning as they always functioned in early July, the water warm but not stressful, the fish feeding actively, the pond edges alive with the insect activity that indicated healthy wetland ecology. "Mine are fine," he said. "How are your earthen ponds?" Bobby frowned. "The earthen ones look okay. It's the concrete-lined pond that's showing stress." Clarence nodded. He didn't say anything further, because he didn't want to seem like he was claiming credit for something he didn't fully understand. But the distinction Bobby had just described, earthen ponds, stable, concrete-lined pond, stressed, matched what his father had told him about the difference between farming with the pond and farming against it. Clarence's method was what aquaculture researchers would eventually call low-density natural pond culture, though Clarence himself had no particular name for it beyond the way we always did it. His 12 acres were stocked at roughly 1,500 fish per acre, a density at which, as the research from Kentucky State University had documented in the 1990s, pond ecosystems could support fish growth partly through natural food production, rather than relying entirely on commercial feed. At 1,500 fish per acre, the nitrogen and organic waste load produced by the fish was low enough to stimulate pond fertility, feeding the insects, crustaceans, worms, and algae that formed the base of the natural food web, without exceeding the pond's biological carrying capacity and tipping into the water quality degradation that characterized intensive production. In a natural earthen pond at low density, the microbial ecosystem was complex, diverse, and self-regulating. The sediment alone harbored thousands of bacterial species, fungal communities, protozoans, and microinvertebrates that collectively maintained a dynamic equilibrium. Competitive exclusion operating at microscopic scale, where no single species, including pathogens, could achieve the density required for explosive proliferation. Flavobacterium columnare was present in virtually every freshwater catfish pond in the delta. The question was never whether it was present, but whether conditions existed for it to achieve pathogenic density and overwhelm the host fish's immune system. In a high-density concrete pond with 4,500 to 5,700 fish per acre, where fish were already under chronic stress from crowding, where metabolic waste loads kept dissolved, oxygen perpetually challenged despite mechanical aeration, and where years of antibiotic use had eliminated susceptible bacterial competitors and created selection pressure favoring resistant strains, conditions for pathogenic columnaris proliferation were being maintained and amplified with every production cycle. In Clarence's ponds, those conditions did not exist. The fish were not crowded. The water quality was maintained by the pond's own biological processes rather than mechanical intervention. No antibiotics had ever entered his ponds, which meant the microbial community in his pond sediment and water column had never experienced the selection pressure that created drug-resistant strains. The diverse microbial ecosystem competed with and suppressed pathogenic bacteria through mechanisms that scientists were still working to characterize fully: competitive exclusion, antibiotic production by soil bacteria, bacteriophage predation, and the immune-stimulating effects of the varied diet that naturally productive ponds provided. Clarence understood none of this in scientific terms. What he understood was what his father had shown him, that a pond with too many fish was a pond fighting itself, and a pond fighting itself would eventually lose. "Give the pond room to breathe," his father had said, "and the pond would do most of the work for you." On the morning of July 14, a car Clarence didn't recognize pulled to a stop on the gravel shoulder at the edge of his property. A woman got out, mid-30s, he estimated, wearing boots that suggested she had planned for field conditions and carrying a clipboard and a small sample collection kit. She walked toward him with the purposeful, slightly uncertain approach of someone who was not entirely sure of her welcome. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I'm Dr. Angela Morrison. I'm an aquatic animal health researcher from Mississippi State. I hope you don't mind. I've been hearing about your ponds from some of the producers in the county, and I was wondering if I might ask you a few questions." Clarence leaned on his pond rake and looked at her. "What kind of questions?" "About your production methods," she said, "and specifically about whether you've seen any columnaris in your fish this summer." "No," Clarence said, "I haven't." Dr. Morrison nodded slowly, as though this answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "Would you be willing to let me take some water and sediment samples, and some fish tissue samples, if any of your fish are showing any stress at all?" Clarence was quiet for a moment. He wasn't opposed to the request. He had worked with extension agents and university researchers before, and he believed in the value of scientific documentation, even if his own methods didn't require it. What he was doing, in that moment of quiet, was making the calculation that any experienced farmer makes when an outsider appears with a clipboard. What does this person actually want? And is their interest compatible with my own? He decided it was. "Come on," he said, and walked her to the nearest pond. What Dr. Morrison found in Clarence's ponds, over the following 2 weeks of sampling, they would take months to fully analyze, but would begin to assemble a picture that she had been building from fragments for 3 years of research into the relationship between pond ecology and disease resistance. The bacterial community in Clarence's pond sediment was, as she would describe in her eventual research notes, extraordinarily diverse, a complex assemblage of species that reflected decades of undisturbed ecological development without antibiotic disruption. The fish she sampled showed no clinical signs of columnaris, and tissue culture from 20 fish across all 4 of Clarence's main production ponds showed no significant Flavobacterium columnare presence. More significantly, the water column bacterial community, the free-swimming microbial ecology of the pond itself, showed high populations of competitive bacteria known to suppress Flavobacterium growth, species that in high antibiotic use environments were typically among the first to be eliminated. The pond was, in the language of the scientific paper she would eventually write, functioning as a self-maintaining biological suppression system. The low fish density meant low stress, which meant strong fish immune function. The absence of antibiotics meant an intact and diverse microbial community in which pathogenic bacteria could not achieve dominance. The earthen pond substrate, with its complex sediment ecosystem, provided a biological filtration and competitive suppression capacity that no concrete-lined, mechanically managed system could replicate. "Mr. Webb," Dr. Morrison said on the afternoon of her 3rd visit, as they stood together at the edge of his largest pond, "can I ask you something? When did your family start farming catfish this way?" Clarence looked out at the pond. The water was dark and still in the afternoon heat, the far edge lined with native wetland grasses his father had deliberately maintained as habitat, rather than clearing for production efficiency. A great blue heron was standing at the shallows 40 yards away, and Clarence had long since made peace with the minor predation toll that herons extracted, because he had also learned that the presence of the herons indicated healthy frog and insect populations at the pond edges, which were part of the food web his fish depended on. "My daddy started farming catfish here in 1962, Clarence said. "Before that, this was his father's land, and before that, his grandfather's. The catfish farming we started in the early 60s. But the way of thinking about it, that goes back further." "What do you mean?" "My daddy used to say, 'You don't own this pond, you're just the person who set it up. The pond does the real work. Your job is not to mess up what the pond is trying to do.'" Clarence paused. He learned that from his mother. She learned it from hers. I don't know how far back it goes. Dr. Morrison was writing in her notebook. She stopped writing and looked up at him. "That's actually a very precise description of a microbial ecology concept that took us until the 1990s to formally articulate." "Well," Clarence said, "my great-grandmother didn't have a microscope." 20 miles away, Keith Dunbar was standing in what had been his most productive pond and looking at water that was wrong in every measurable way. The aerator was running. The dissolved oxygen read 6.1, which was technically adequate, but the fish remaining in the pond, perhaps 2,800 of the original 9,400 that had been stocked 6 months earlier, were moving with the desultory, apathetic quality of animals that were surviving rather than thriving. The columnaris had burned through the pond in 3 weeks, and what remained was a rump population that had survived through some combination of natural disease resistance and the partial suppression achieved by the aquaflora before the resistant strain had established its dominance. Keith had been in aquaculture for 12 years. He had navigated ESC outbreaks, oxygen crashes, off-flavor events, and the 2015 flood that had breached 2 of Consolidated's ponds and required complete restocking. He had always found a technical solution, a management adjustment, a veterinary intervention, an engineering modification that addressed the problem and allowed the operation to continue at its previous level of efficiency. This was the first time he was standing in front of a problem for which his toolkit had not worked. He pulled out his phone and called David. "Get me the final mortality count for ponds 7, 9, 11, 14, 16, 19, 22, and 25. I want total numbers and percentage of stocked population. David called back in 40 minutes with numbers that Keith wrote in his notebook without speaking. When he added them up, the total mortality across the 8 worst affected ponds came to 67,400 fish, representing 71.3% of the combined stocked population across those ponds. Keith sat down on the pond levee and looked at the water for a long time. He was still sitting there when his phone rang. It was Dr. Patterson. "I've been talking with Angela Morrison at the vet school," she said. "She's been doing sampling at some of the non-affected operations in the county. I think you should hear what she found." "Go ahead." "There's an operation in your county, 12 acres, natural earthen ponds, a producer named Webb, that shows 0 columnaris this summer. Not reduced levels, 0. Angela has been sampling his ponds for 2 weeks, and she's finding a microbial community in his pond water that is functionally suppressing Flavobacterium growth. His fish immune profiles look completely different from what we're seeing in high-density operations. And he's never used antibiotics." There was a silence on the line. "Never?" Keith said. "Never. 60 years of fish farming on that property, no antibiotic applications ever. His pond microbiome is intact and diverse in ways that we haven't documented in any commercial operation in the Delta, because every commercial operation has been using antibiotics for decades and selecting for resistant strains in the BICE process." Dr. Patterson paused. "Angela is wondering if you'd be willing to talk to him." Keith looked at what remained of Pond 7's fish population. Then he said, "Set it up." The meeting between Keith Dunbar and Clarence Webb happened on a Tuesday morning in early August at Clarence's property. Dr. Morrison was present, and she had brought a graduate student named James Park who was responsible for taking field notes and additional water samples. Keith arrived in his consolidated company truck, which he noticed Clarence looking at with a neutral expression before extending his hand. They spent 3 hours at the ponds. Keith was a trained aquaculture engineer, and he understood the technical framework of what Dr. Morrison was describing, even as he struggled to reconcile it with 12 years of believing that intensive, technology-driven production was unambiguously superior to low-density traditional methods. Dr. Morrison walked him through the microbial data, the diversity indices, the competitive suppression mechanisms, the relationship between antibiotic use and the loss of the natural biological controls that had made the earthen pond ecosystem resistant to pathogenic outbreak. Clarence listened and occasionally answered questions, but mostly he walked with them and let his ponds do the explaining. He showed Keith the natural pond edges, the wetland grass buffers his father had maintained, which provided insect habitat and natural food input. He showed him the sediment color at different depths, explaining with the patience of someone who had been reading pond conditions for half a century that the dark, rich sediment in a natural pond was not waste accumulation, but biological capital, a living bank of microbial diversity that was doing work no engineering system had yet replicated. He showed Keith how his fish responded to his approach, not with the frantic, stressed scatter of crowded fish, startled by proximity, but with the calm schooling behavior of fish that had never been pushed to the metabolic limits of their tolerance. At one point, Keith asked the question that had been forming in his mind since he arrived: if this method is more disease-resistant, why isn't everyone doing it? Clarence looked at him without any particular expression. "Because my way makes 1,500 pounds an acre and your way makes 5,700. If there's no disease, your way makes more money. You only find out about the problem when the disease comes." Keith nodded slowly. "And the disease came. The disease came," Clarence agreed. 90% of aquatic bacteria in intensively managed catfish ponds were resistant to at least one antibiotic. 20% were multi-drug resistant. The Flavobacterium covey strain that had swept through Consolidated and dozens of other high-density operations across the Delta in the summer of 2019 was the predictable product of selection pressure that had been building. since the widespread introduction of therapeutic antibiotics into catfish production in the 1970s. Every antibiotic treatment that killed susceptible bacteria had left resistant survivors, and those survivors had reproduced and exchanged resistance genes with other bacterial species through horizontal gene transfer, creating a pond environment in which the tools designed to control disease were actively training the disease to resist them. Clarence's ponds contained columnaris bacteria. They always had. What they didn't contain was a resistant strain that could overpower the biological control mechanisms of an intact pond ecosystem, because the intact pond ecosystem had never experienced the selection pressure that would have created one. Keith Dunbar visited Clarence's property 3 more times during the course of the research project. The conversations evolved from technical exchange to something closer to genuine dialogue, a process of 2 men with very different training and very different relationships to the same landscape trying to understand what the other knew. Keith was not comfortable with what the research was suggesting, because what it was suggesting was that the efficiency gains he had spent 12 years achieving had been accumulating a biological debt that had come due in a single catastrophic season. The 68% production loss at Consolidated in the second half of 2019 had, when he worked through the full accounting, eliminated the profit margin of the previous 4 years. 12 years of intensive optimization had not built resilience. It had built vulnerability. Clarence was not comfortable with the attention, for different reasons. He had spent 50 years being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that his method was outdated, that the future of catfish farming in the Delta was high density, high efficiency, technology-driven production, and that small traditional operators like him were relics being slowly displaced by agricultural progress. To have researchers suddenly arriving at his ponds to document what he had always done felt, in some ways, like a validation that arrived 50 years too late to matter for most of the Delta's traditional farming community. The African-American farming families who had been the backbone of agricultural life in Humphreys County had been steadily losing land and operations since the 1960s, squeezed by economic pressures, discriminatory lending, and the industrialization of agriculture that rewarded scale above all else. By 2019, there were very few operations in Humphreys County that looked like Clarence's. He was not entirely sure whether being studied was progress or an obituary. But he participated in the research because he had a practical reason. He wanted the knowledge to survive, even if the farms like his didn't. The Mississippi State Research Team published its first peer-reviewed paper in the journal Aquaculture in the spring of 2021, under the title Natural Pond Microbial Diversity as a Biological Control Mechanism Against Flavobacterium columnare in Channel Catfish Production. The paper documented the correlation between pond stocking density, antibiotic treatment history, microbial diversity indices, and columnaris disease incidence across 47 operations in Humphreys, Sunflower, and Washington counties in Mississippi. Its core finding, that natural earthen ponds at low density with no antibiotic treatment history showed 94% lower pathogenic columnaris incidence than high-density operations with antibiotic treatment histories, drew immediate attention from aquaculture researchers and industry observers. The paper was cited 31 times in its first year, an unusually high rate for a journal in the specialty. It was discussed at the Aquaculture America 2022 conference in San Antonio, where Dr. Morrison presented the data to an audience that included representatives from catfish processing companies, the USDA, the FDA's Center for Veterinary Medicine, and the Aquaculture Stewardship Council's North American Standards Team. The conversation it generated at that conference contributed directly to the ASC's decision to initiate a scope extension project examining catfish aquaculture, a project that would ultimately result in new sustainability standards that included criteria for reduced antibiotic use, microbial diversity maintenance, and stocking density limits that reflected the disease suppression data from the Mississippi research. By 2022, Keith Dunbar had begun implementing changes at Consolidated. The changes were not radical, and they were not adopted all at once. The economics of transitioning a 340-acre intensive operation toward lower density were complicated, and Consolidated's existing contracts with processing plants were written around yield commitments that couldn't simply be abandoned. But Keith worked with Dr. Morrison and the USDA research team to pilot a hybrid approach in 12 ponds, reduced stocking density, extended antibiotic-free periods, and deliberate management of pond edge vegetation to support the natural food web. The ponds in the pilot showed, within 18 months, measurably higher microbial diversity and lower pathogenic bacterial loads than the ponds maintained under the original intensive protocol. He also hired James Park, Dr. Morrison's former graduate student, as Consolidated's first in-house aquatic ecologist, a position that would not have existed or even made conceptual sense under the operational philosophy Keith had practiced for his first 12 years at the company. Across the Delta, the 2019 outbreak had prompted a broader re-examination of production practices that had been building quietly among catfish farmers for years, but had been difficult to act on when intensive methods appeared economically superior. In the year following the outbreak, the Mississippi Catfish Farmers Association commissioned a survey of 187 operations in the state's primary catfish-producing counties. The survey found that 34% of respondents were actively exploring or implementing reduced-density management practices. 28% had reduced antibiotic use in at least a portion of their operations, and 19% were maintaining or restoring natural pond edge vegetation as a management strategy. These numbers were small, but they represented a meaningful shift in an industry whose standard practices had not changed substantially since the 1980s. The economic argument for natural pond culture was, in the years following 2019, no longer as simple as pounds per acre production efficiency. The 2019 outbreak had introduced a new variable, catastrophic loss risk, that the efficiency calculations had never adequately weighted, because the outbreak had never happened at that scale before. When Keith Dunbar recalculated his 12-year financial performance accounting for the 2019 losses, the intensive model's apparent profitability advantage over low-density traditional methods nearly disappeared. When he added to that calculation the rising cost of medicated feed, the increasing veterinary intervention required to manage drug-resistant strains, the energy costs of continuous aeration, and the regulatory risk associated with AMR concerns that were attracting FDA and EPA attention, the economics shifted further. Low-density natural pond culture was less efficient in the absence of disease. But in the presence of the disease that the industry's own practices had created and amplified, it was dramatically more resilient. The letter, signed by Dr. Morrison and the project's principal investigator, thanked him for his participation, and noted that his management records, the hand-kept logs, his father had started in 1962, recording stocking densities, feed amounts, watercolor observations, weather patterns, and harvest weights across 57 years of continuous operation on the same land, were being digitized with his permission and would be incorporated into the project's baseline data set. Clarence read the letter at his kitchen table and set it down and looked out the window at his ponds, which were winter quiet in December, the water dark and still, the edges brown with dormant grass, the herons gone south but certain to return. 57 years of his family's knowledge was being turned into data. He wasn't sure whether he found that comforting or slightly absurd. Both, perhaps. He called his daughter in Jackson and read her the letter. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Grandpa was right. Grandpa was always right," Clarence said. It just took them a while to measure it. The formal legacy of the 2019 Humphreys County columnaris outbreak and the research it prompted continued to develop over the following years. The Mississippi State Research Team published 4 peer-reviewed papers between 2021 and 2023, collectively establishing the scientific framework for what they termed biological reserve capacity in natural pond aquaculture, the capacity of intact, diverse pond ecosystems to resist pathogenic outbreak without pharmacological intervention. The papers were cited in FDA guidance documents on antibiotic use in aquaculture issued in 2022, which strengthened restrictions on the preventive use of medically important antibiotics in fish production and created new reporting requirements for therapeutic use that would allow federal agencies to track AMR development in aquaculture environments. The Aquaculture Stewardship Council, in its 2024 Catfish Scope Extension process, incorporated criteria derived from the Mississippi research into its draft farm standard for catfish production. The relevant provisions established maximum stocking density limits for certified operations, required documentation of antibiotic use history with caps on therapeutic application frequency, and incentivized, though did not mandate, earthen pond construction and natural pond edge management as practices associated with measurably improved disease resilience. The ASC's 2024 Impacts Report noted that the Catfish Standard Scope Extension represented the first time traditional ecological knowledge, formally documented through community-based research, had directly informed ASC certification criteria. Keith Dunbar submitted Consolidated Catfish Producers Application for ASC certification in March 2024, a process that would require further reduction in stocking density in 3 pond clusters, a 2-year antibiotic-free period in the certification candidate ponds, and documentation of the hybrid management practices that had been piloted since 2022. He estimated it would take until 2026 to achieve full certification across the facility. He also noted, in the application paperwork, that the model for the practices being certified had been documented on a 12-acre operation run by a 73-year-old farmer 3 miles from his facility. The ASC reviewer, reading the application, noted the reference and flagged it for follow-up. By 2024, Clarence Webb's ponds had been the subject of academic papers, conference presentations, extension service workshops, and a documentary segment produced by Mississippi Public Broadcasting that aired in the spring of that year. He had spoken at 2 aquaculture conferences, once in Biloxi and once, at the invitation of Dr. Morrison's research team, at the World Aquaculture Society annual meeting in New Orleans, without changing his farming methods by a single meaningful variable. He still stocked at 1,500 fish per acre. He still maintained his pond edges with native wetland vegetation. He still kept handwritten logs in the same format his father had established in 1962. He still spent his mornings walking his ponds, reading the water with his hands and eyes, checking on what the pond was doing before he decided what he would do. He was 75 years old by then, and he knew, with the matter-of-fact clarity that comes to farmers who have spent long careers watching living things age, that his question was no longer whether his methods worked, but whether anyone else would maintain them after he was gone. He had 2 grandchildren who visited his farm with genuine enthusiasm when they came to see him, and he was teaching them, the way his father had taught him and his grandmother before that, how to read the color of pond water and how to watch fish for the signs of stress before any instrument could measure it. Whether they would farm when the time came, he didn't know. What he knew was that the knowledge was being passed down, which was what knowledge was supposed to do. The Aquaculture Stewardship Council's 2024 Catfish Standard, when it was published for stakeholder consultation in September of that year, included in its preamble a paragraph acknowledging that sustainable aquaculture practices were not exclusively the product of modern science, and that traditional ecological knowledge developed through generations of direct observation and practice represented a form of empirical understanding that formal research had the responsibility to document, validate, and transmit. The paragraph had been drafted by the ASC's Standards Committee after reviewing the Mississippi State research papers, and it did not mention Clarence Webb by name. But the committee chair, in correspondence with Dr. Morrison, had noted that the underlying research made the inclusion necessary. Keith Dunbar called Clarence the week the draft standard was published. He had been doing this occasionally for the past 4 years, brief calls, professional but warm, the 2 men checking in across the distance of their different positions in an industry that both of them had spent their lives in. They published the draft standard, Keith said. I heard, Clarence said. There's language in the preamble about traditional knowledge. Angela told me. There was a comfortable pause, the kind of pause that happens between people who have been through something significant together and don't need to fill every silence. Then Keith said, 60 years of your family's records are in their database now. That's going to be training the industry for a long time. Clarence looked out his window at his ponds in the late September light. The herons were back. The water was the color it always was in fall, a deep, settled brown-green that he had been reading every morning for 51 years and still found, in its ordinary particularity, completely absorbing. My daddy would have said the pond trained us first, Clarence said. We just wrote down what it taught. He set the phone down and went outside to walk his ponds, as he did every morning, as his father had done before him, as the knowledge required.